I am Mark and I like to talk about British politics and yes, Brexit, even if a lot of people don't want to talk about this anymore, but it will be a topic for the next years. And I do it from an outside view. But don't worry, I know the UK from the inside as well. But today we start with the fact that on June 23rd, 2016, 52% of the British population voted in a referendum for Britain to leave the European Union. And after a long negotiating process and several postponements, the United Kingdom has not been a member of the EU since January 31st in 2020 and has not been part of the single market and the customs union since January 1st in 2021. And since the exit, trade in goods and services between the United Kingdom and the EU has become more difficult, and trade barriers and the departure from EU standards have resulted even in a number of companies moving their locations out of the United Kingdom. And so there are a lot of repercussions still coming. And now an American study indicates that the United Kingdom is struggling with the effects of Brexit and austerity policies. The researchers have found that this has led to a decline in effective state governance and long-term scars that have hampered economic growth and undermined social cohesion. They are calling for urgent structural changes to prevent serious problems that could negatively impact citizens' quality of life even more. The study, conducted by the University of California in Los Angeles, the UCLA, and the Hertie School in Berlin in Germany, warns of several interdependent crises stemming from past failures. They identified a decline in the quality of governance as the main cause. Although the UK has historically been one of the best performing countries globally, today there are signs of stagnation and erosion, particularly in terms of the state's ability to address social and economic challenges. The researchers assessed the last 14 years of conservative governing using the Berggruen Governance Index, or BGI, which looks at the quality of a population's life as the result of the interaction between the strength of democratic accountability and the functioning of government. They found that the UK began with high levels of governance, but over time, factors have been identified that have weakened democracy and the state's capacity. These include a lack of investment in infrastructure and growing regional inequalities, among others, which have led to political headwinds. Low trust ratings in many public institutions in the UK, caused by scandals such as the breaches of lockdown rules and parliamentary standards, increased public discontent, according to the report. The incoming Labour government will face the challenge of restoring public trust and building a long-term growth model for the economy. Labour has already made economic growth a priority and made various commitments, including strict rules on taxes and public spending, reforms to the planning system to encourage housing and infrastructure, and investments in clean energy, even if they rode back a bit there. Despite the challenges, the UK continues to rank in the top 145 countries in the Berggruen Governance Index. Quality of life and democratic accountability ratings have remained largely consistent between 2010 and 2021. However, the rating for state capacity, that means the quality of governance, has decreased by 5 points over the same period. The study attributes this decline mainly to an interaction of austerity policies and political dysfunction. Economic stagnation after 2010 drew focus to polarizing issues such as Brexit and immigration. As a result, structural reforms to implement Brexit were neglected, and this led to less discipline in leadership and weaker governance when the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020. The lack of investment activity, especially since the 2008 financial crisis, has led to infrastructural problems and regional inequality. The UK has been far behind the EU average in terms of capital formation, that's a measure of investment, and that since 2020. The chronic lack of investment has led to problems in transport and a lack of affordable housing near employment centers. This in turn has led to stagnating productivity and declining gross domestic product. The Brexit decision has also increased regional inequalities. EU funding for poor regions has disappeared after Brexit. The researchers therefore stress that the UK must finally take regional planning seriously to examine the reasons for the decline in state capacity and make serious structural changes. Overall, the study concludes that austerity policies and Brexit have left long-term scars on the UK economy and are affecting social cohesion in the country. It stresses that urgent action is needed to address these problems and restore the UK's long-term growth potential. And now, it's also a question of how Great Britain can get closer to the EU. One example is from January 26th, the EU will impose tariffs on emission-intensive products such as steel and cement as part of the European CO2 border adjustment system, which would make the export of British products to the EU even more expensive. Great Britain can only prevent this by setting up such a system and linking the two then. And since Great Britain is now a third country, food is checked on both sides of the border when imported and exported, with a corresponding bureaucracy and delays. London had delayed its own checks several times, but a solution must be found here, and this would be a mutual veterinary agreement that could avoid extensive controls on animals, animal products and plants. And according to the EU ambassador to Great Britain, the EU would be willing to do this, but only if Great Britain followed the EU's regulations. I said that this week already, but I think it's important. How these are to be interpreted would not be decided on the island, but by the European Court of Justice. And British media, such as the daily newspaper The Telegraph, are already railing against Labour, wanting to reverse Brexit and subject the country to the rulings of a foreign court again. Well, something similar would happen if Britain wanted to negotiate an agreement for the chemical industry to save companies the expensive double registration of chemicals in Britain and the EU. And that were just a few examples, and I know I repeated them, but they are important. And Britain has thus involuntarily become a rule taker, a country that has to follow EU regulations but can no longer influence them. So that's the opposite of what Brexit promised. But the EU Commission also has wishes for the United Kingdom. There is, for example, the mobility agreement that for 4 years, which could offer young people cross-border work experience and possibly a return from Great Britain to the Erasmus Plus program. And the Commission is also waiting for a rapprochement on the issue of hydrogen, which the EU would like to import from the United Kingdom by a pipeline. And that should help to achieve the zero emissions target of the EU by 2050. But there is a problem for the London government. The EU wants a rapprochement, but there will be no cherry picking. Still not even under Labour. And there will be no renegotiation of the TCA. What is planned, and that's what the Commission is prepared to do, is to make technical improvements that could make the implementation of the agreement easier. But that's it. The rapprochement with the EU on foreign and security policy issues desired by foreign policy spokesman Lammy is also more complicated than London had hoped. I talked about this week before, so I will not repeat all the security part again. But there were a lot of things in the election campaign, and I mentioned that in my videos going forward to the campaign, to the election day, that were just not anywhere near reality. The EU wants closer cooperation, and it cooperates with other third countries as well. That's not the problem, be it with trade agreements or be it with in the security sector and the defense sector, especially now after Russia invaded the Ukraine for the second time. They of course want that. But once again, there will be no cherry picking. And some things that is discussed, as I said this yesterday, about the joining the single market or the customs union is out of the question. And the return of Britain to the EU is something that probably will be talked about in the distant future. That is all not possible now. And everything the EU would give would require taking over EU regulations to make anything easier here. And the EU is the one with a big market that British companies want to get into. And it will be their regulations, not the British ones. If you want to play with the club, even if you don't want to be a member, you have to follow the rules of the club. And so that will be a decision Labour has to make. Even the Tories realized that when they didn't scrap the EU regulations from EU times in Britain. They just scrapped a very small minority of those regulations existing because it was impossible to do without wrecking their economy even more. But that is the thing. They have to finally come to reality, and the population in Britain, that's the more important part, has to come to reality. Closer relation with the EU means accepting EU regulations if you want to have trade easier, or you won't get it. And it also means that the last word will always be at the ECJ in those sectors. And then they have to make a decision. I'm saying this very clearly. It's not something about the arrogant EU wanting that, whatever. I can hear the Brexiteer comments already. This is just the reality. And people must finally face reality and how the planet works. There is no cherry picking. There is no wishful thinking. There is no unicorns. And the people in politics are still promising unicorns here. You will not get a unicorn. What you can get is a horse. But the horse has its own roots. I don't know where I wanted to go from here, but I hope you understood what I want to say with that. Sometimes the non-native speaker thing is a bit complicated. Nevertheless, come to reality, and then the decisions are much easier. Leave out the castles in the sky and stick to the ground. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.